It was 11:47 at night when the ambulance doors burst open at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And in that moment, I had no idea I was about to witness something that would shatter everything I believed about life and medicine. The sound of metal wheels scraping against the floor echoed through the emergency corridor as they rushed in a man whose heart had already given up fighting. His face was pale, almost gray, and the paramedic's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. 52-year-old male, full cardiac arrest, down for 8 minutes. 8 minutes. In my 18 years as a cardiologist here in Chicago, I'd learned that 8 minutes was often the difference between a miracle and a tragedy. But that night, something in the air felt different. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, or how the usual hospital sounds felt muffled, as if the world was holding its breath. I remember thinking this would be just another case, another night where I'd either save a life or lose one. I was wrong. My name is Dr. Thomas Kowalski, and I thought I had seen everything. After nearly 2 decades of working in one of Chicago's busiest cardiac units, I believe nothing could surprise me anymore. I'd witnessed hearts stop and restart. I'd seen families crumble and rebuild in hospital waiting rooms, and I'd made peace with the fact that sometimes, despite all our knowledge and technology, we simply cannot control life and death. That night, I was about to learn just how little control we actually have. The patient's name was Robert Sullivan, though everyone called him Bob. His wife, Margaret, was running behind the stretcher, her face streaked with tears, and her hands trembling uncontrollably. She was wearing a faded blue nightgown under her winter coat, and I could see she had rushed out of bed when this nightmare began. Her eyes met mine for just a second, and in that glance, I saw a question that every doctor knows by heart. Please, can you save him? But there was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like faith. As if she knew something I didn't. The monitors were already screaming as we transferred Bob to our emergency table. His heart rhythm was completely flat, not even the faintest electrical activity. Nurse Angela Moretti, who had been working beside me for over a decade, immediately began chest compressions while Dr. Marcus Washington prepared the defibrillator. The room filled with that familiar orchestrated chaos of emergency medicine, hands moving with precision, voices calling out vital signs, the mechanical sound of the ventilator forcing air into lungs that couldn't breathe on their own. But something felt different this time. Usually, in these critical moments, my mind becomes laser-focused, almost mechanical. Every decision flows from years of training and experience. That night, however, I found myself oddly aware of details that normally escape my attention. The way Margaret's wedding ring caught the harsh hospital lights, the small cross pendant hanging from her neck, moving slightly each time she breathed. The way Bob's calloused hands suggested a lifetime of hard work, probably construction or factory labor. Hands that had built things and provided for his family. How long has he been down now? I asked, though I already knew the answer was pushing us toward that invisible line where hope begins to fade. 12 minutes total, Angela replied, never breaking the rhythm of her compressions. Sweat was already beading on her forehead, despite the cool temperature we kept in the emergency room. 12 minutes. In medical school, they teach you that brain damage becomes likely after 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen. After 10 minutes, the chances of meaningful recovery drop dramatically. After 15 minutes, you're essentially performing a ritual more than medicine. But something inside me refused to accept those textbook numbers that night. Maybe it was the way Margaret stood in the corner, not crying anymore, but instead quietly moving her lips in what I could only assume was prayer. Maybe it was how Bob's face, despite the grayish pallor, still held traces of what must have been a warm smile in better times. Dr. Washington charged the defibrillator to 200 joules. "Clear!" he called out, and everyone stepped back as electricity coursed through Bob's chest. The monitor showed nothing but that terrible flat line. We tried again at 300 joules. Still nothing. The silence between each shock felt heavier than usual, as if the room itself was waiting for something. "Let's try epinephrine," I said, though we had already given him 2 doses. Angela drew up another syringe with practiced efficiency, her movements steady despite what I knew must be her own growing concern. In all our years working together, we had developed an almost telepathic communication during these critical moments. That night, when our eyes met briefly over Bob's motionless body, I could see she was thinking the same thing I was. We were losing him. The clock on the wall read 11:59. In the span of 12 minutes, a man's life had been reduced to flat lines on a monitor and the mechanical sound of machines doing what his body could no longer do. His skin was growing cooler to the touch, and that grayish color was spreading. Medical science was telling us it was time to stop, time to face the reality that sometimes, despite our best efforts, people die. But Margaret hadn't moved from her corner. She wasn't wailing or demanding we do more. Instead, she stood there with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, her hand clutching that small cross, her lips still moving silently. There was something about her presence that made me hesitate to call the time of death. Something that made me feel like this story wasn't finished yet. The monitor continued its monotonous beep, marking each second of a heart that had given up. 14 minutes now. In the medical textbooks, Bob Sullivan should have already been beyond our reach. His brain should have been shutting down, his organs beginning their final surrender. Everything I had learned in 18 years of practice was telling me to prepare Margaret for the worst news a wife could hear. But I had no idea the night still held something impossible. You have to understand something about being a cardiologist for 18 years. You develop what we call clinical detachment. It's not that we don't care. It's that caring too much would destroy us. Every day we make life and death decisions that would paralyze most people. We see families torn apart by sudden heart attacks. We watch children lose their fathers. We witness the exact moment when hope dies in someone's eyes. If we absorbed all of that pain, we'd never be able to function. So we learn to compartmentalize, to focus on the medical facts rather than the human drama unfolding before us. That night, standing over Bob Sullivan's lifeless body, I realized just how much I had relied on that detachment. For nearly 2 decades, it had been my shield, my way of surviving in a profession where death is always lurking in the next room. But something about this case was different. Maybe it was the way Margaret stood in that corner, radiating a quiet strength that seemed to fill the entire emergency. Maybe it was how Bob's weathered hands reminded me of my own father's hands. Hands that had worked construction sites across Chicago's South Side until his own heart gave out when I was just starting medical school. My journey to cardiology hadn't been conventional. Growing up in a Polish immigrant family in the Pilsen neighborhood, I was the first in my family to attend college, let alone medical school. My parents, Stefan and Anna Kowalski, had come to America with nothing but hope and an unshakable faith that hard work could overcome any obstacle. They worked double shifts, my father laying bricks, my mother cleaning office buildings downtown, just to pay for my education. When I told them I wanted to specialize in hearts, my mother had smiled and said, "Tommy, you always had the biggest heart in the family. Now you'll learn to fix broken ones." But 18 years into my career, I wondered if my own heart had somehow hardened along the way. I'd saved hundreds of lives, yes. But I'd also lost count of how many families I'd had to console, how many times I'd had to deliver news that would change everything. The victories began to blur together, and the losses, well, you learn to file those away where they can't touch you during the next case. Standing there at 11:59, watching Bob Sullivan's flat line continue across the monitor, I found myself thinking about those early years when every save felt like a miracle, and every loss felt personal. Back then, I used to go home after difficult cases and call my parents, seeking their wisdom about life and death and the weight of responsibility. My father would always say the same thing. "Tommy, you do your best, and then you trust God with the rest." My mother would add, "Some battles are fought with medicine, others require something more." Those words had seemed so simple back then, maybe even naive. After all, I was armed with the latest medical technology, years of training, and the backing of one of Chicago's premier cardiac units. What more could there be? But as the years passed, and I witnessed case after case where medical intervention alone seemed insufficient, I began to understand what they meant. There were moments, rare but unmistakable, when something beyond our instruments and protocols appeared to influence the outcome. Dr. Marcus Washington had been my colleague for 6 years, and in that time, we'd developed the kind of professional partnership that only comes from sharing life and death moments. He was younger than me, full of the same scientific confidence I'd once possessed, but he'd also begun to recognize those inexplicable cases that challenged our understanding. That night, as he prepared for another round of defibrillation, I caught him glancing at Margaret with the same puzzled expression I felt. There was something about her presence that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. Angela Moretti had seen it all in her 15 years as an emergency room nurse. She'd assisted in countless resuscitations, witnessed miracles and tragedies in equal measure, and developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when a case was truly hopeless. But that night, even as we pushed past the 15-minute mark, well beyond what medical science considers viable, she continued her chest compressions with a determination that surprised me. When I caught her eye, she simply said, "Something feels different about this one, Dr. Kowalski." The thing about working in emergency medicine is that you become attuned to subtleties that others might miss. The way a patient's color changes, the slight variations in heart rhythm that might indicate improvement or deterioration, the almost imperceptible shifts in a family member's demeanor that signal whether they're preparing for good news or bad. That night, despite every medical indicator pointing toward an inevitable outcome, those subtleties were telling a different story. Margaret hadn't spoken a word since we'd begun working on her husband, but her presence was louder than any scream. She wasn't the typical distraught spouse we usually encountered. There was no pleading, no desperate bargaining, no collapse into inconsolable grief. Instead, she stood there with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly, her hand still clutching that small cross, her lips moving in what I could only assume was continuous prayer. I'd seen faith before in our emergency room. Desperate faith, angry faith, bargaining faith, all the ways people try to negotiate with God when faced with the unthinkable. But this was different. Margaret's faith seemed less like desperation and more like knowing. As if she possessed some piece of information the rest of us lacked. 15 minutes and 30 seconds. Bob's body temperature was dropping, his skin taking on that waxy appearance that signals the body's systems beginning their final shutdown. By every medical standard, we should have stopped our efforts minutes ago. The chances of meaningful recovery were essentially zero. But something kept us going, some inexplicable feeling that this story wasn't over yet. The monitors continued their steady documentation of a life that should have already ended. While outside our emergency room, Northwestern Memorial Hospital continued its 24-hour dance of healing and loss. But in our small corner of that vast medical complex, time seemed suspended, waiting for something none of us could name. And what happened next is something I'll carry with me forever. To understand what made this case so extraordinary, I need to tell you about Robert Sullivan. Not just the patient lying motionless on our table, but the man whose life was hanging in the balance. Earlier that evening, around 9:30, Margaret had called 911 from their modest home in Bridgeport, another working-class Chicago neighborhood not far from where I'd grown up. Bob had been watching the late news, complaining about some chest discomfort that he'd been ignoring for weeks. Like so many men his age, he'd brushed off the warning signs, telling Margaret it was just heartburn from the Italian beef sandwich he'd eaten for dinner. But Margaret knew her husband better than he knew himself. They'd been married for 27 years, and she could read his expressions like a book she'd memorized page by page. When Bob suddenly grabbed his chest and his face went white as fresh snow, she didn't hesitate. She called for help and immediately started talking to him, keeping him conscious during those crucial first minutes when his heart was beginning to fail. "Stay with me, Bobby," she had whispered, holding his hand as the paramedics worked. "Remember what Father McKenna said at Mass last Sunday. We're never alone in our darkest moments." Those were the last words Bob heard before his heart stopped completely in the ambulance, 7 blocks away from Northwestern Memorial. The paramedics who brought him in were veterans, Jim Rodriguez and Sarah Chen, 2 of the best emergency medical technicians in the city. I'd worked with them dozens of times over the years, and I could tell from their expressions that they'd already witnessed something unusual during the transport. Jim pulled me aside while we were transferring Bob to our table. "Doc, I've been doing this for 12 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like what happened in that ambulance." The guy was completely flatlined for 6 straight minutes. We were about to call it when his wife asked if she could hold his hand. The moment she touched him, we got a faint rhythm back, just for about 30 seconds, but it was enough to get us here. Sarah nodded, her usually steady voice carrying an undertone I'd never heard before. It was like she somehow reached in and reminded his heart to keep fighting. I know how that sounds, but I'm telling you, the timing was impossible to ignore. As I processed this information, I found myself studying Margaret more carefully. She was a small woman, probably no more than 5 feet 3 inches tall, with graying auburn hair that she'd clearly put up hastily before rushing to the hospital. Her hands were the hands of someone who'd worked hard her entire life, cleaning houses, taking care of her family, probably never asking for much in return. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of deep reserves of strength, the kind that comes from facing life's challenges with unwavering faith. Bob himself was a study in contradictions. His medical chart showed a man who should have been a textbook candidate for cardiac problems. 52 years old, overweight, high blood pressure, a 2-pack-a-day smoking habit he'd only quit 3 years earlier. His cholesterol levels were concerning, and his family history included a father who'd had his first heart attack at 49. Everything about his profile suggested this was an inevitable outcome, just a matter of when, not if. But looking at him lying there, I could see traces of the man he'd been before this moment. His calloused hands told the story of 30 years working construction, building the office towers and residential developments that dotted Chicago's skyline. Margaret had mentioned during the initial intake that he'd just been promoted to foreman on a major downtown project, something he'd been working toward his entire career. He was so proud, she had told Nurse Angela while we prepared our equipment. Finally getting the recognition he deserved after all these years. He kept saying he wanted to work just 5 more years, save up enough money so we could travel a little. Maybe see Ireland where his grandparents came from. Those personal details, the dreams deferred, the simple hopes for a future that now seemed impossible. They shouldn't have mattered to my medical decision-making. But 18 years of practice had taught me that patients aren't just collections of symptoms and vital signs. They're fathers and husbands, dreamers and workers, people whose lives touch dozens of others in ways both small and profound. Dr. Washington was monitoring Bob's blood chemistry, running tests that would help us understand the extent of the damage to his heart muscle. After 16 minutes without effective circulation, we were looking at significant tissue death, potentially massive enough to make survival impossible, even if we could restart his heart. The numbers were grim. His cardiac enzymes were through the roof, indicating severe damage to the heart wall. "Dr. Kowalski," Marcus said quietly, showing me the latest lab results. "Even if we get him back, the damage might be too extensive. His ejection fraction would be—" He paused, not wanting to say the words in front of Margaret. I understood. An ejection fraction, the percentage of blood the heart pumps out with each beat, below 30% meant a life of severe limitations, constant medication, and the likelihood of needing a heart transplant that, given Bob's age and overall health, he probably wouldn't qualify for. We weren't just fighting to save his life. We were fighting for any kind of meaningful life at all. But something about Margaret's unwavering presence kept pushing those statistical realities to the back of my mind. I'd noticed that she'd moved slightly closer to the table during the past few minutes, and while she still hadn't spoken, her lips had never stopped moving in what I could only assume was continuous prayer. There was something almost hypnotic about her quiet faith, the way it seemed to create a bubble of calm in the middle of our medical storm. Angela caught my attention with a slight nod toward the monitor. "Doctor, look at this," she said softly. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, the completely flat line had shown the tiniest blip, barely perceptible, like a whisper on the screen. It wasn't a heartbeat, not even close, but it was electrical activity where there had been none for 17 minutes. "Probably just artifact, Doctor," Washington said, referring to the false signals that can sometimes appear on monitors due to movement or electrical interference. But Angela shook her head. Nobody moved, and look. She pointed to the other monitors. No interference on any other readings. I stared at that monitor, willing it to show another sign, any sign, that Bob Sullivan was still fighting. In medical school, they teach you to trust the instruments, to base your decisions on objective data rather than hope or intuition. But they don't teach you what to do when your instruments show you something that shouldn't be possible. 18 minutes now. We were well beyond the point where any reasonable physician would have stopped resuscitation efforts. The family consultation I should have been having with Margaret should have been about organ donation and funeral arrangements. But something kept us working. Some inexplicable feeling that we were participating in something larger than standard emergency medicine. The room had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual hospital sounds from the corridor seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Margaret had stepped even closer now. Close enough that I could hear her whispered words, though I couldn't make out what she was saying. Her hand was still clutching that small cross, and I noticed for the first time that it was worn smooth, probably from years of faithful handling. None of us were prepared for what was about to unfold. The silence in that emergency room had become almost tangible, broken only by the mechanical whoosh of the ventilator and the steady beep of monitors that should have been registering life but weren't. It was now 12:07 in the morning, and Bob Sullivan had been without a heartbeat for 20 minutes. 20 minutes that had stretched beyond every medical guideline, every protocol we followed, every reasonable expectation of human survival. I remember looking at the clock and feeling something I'd never experienced in all my years of practice. A complete disconnect between what medical science was telling me and what something deeper, more intuitive, was whispering. Every textbook, every research study, every case I'd ever witnessed said we should stop. But Margaret's presence seemed to fill the room with an energy that made stopping feel like giving up on something sacred, something that wasn't finished yet. Dr. Washington had grown increasingly uncomfortable with our continued efforts. He was a good doctor, methodical and evidence-based, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. We'd already pushed far beyond standard protocols, and he was starting to look at me with concern, probably wondering if I was letting emotion cloud my medical judgment. During a brief moment when we stepped back to reassess, he pulled me aside. "Tom," he said quietly, using my first name in a way that told me he was speaking as a friend, not just a colleague. "We've done everything we can. 20 minutes is... it's time to consider calling it." I understood his position completely. Marcus was protecting both the patient and our professional integrity. Continuing aggressive measures on someone who was essentially gone could be seen as prolonging suffering rather than providing care. But when I looked back at Margaret, still standing in that corner with her quiet strength radiating throughout the room, I found myself saying words that surprised even me. "Give me 5 more minutes," I heard myself say. "Just 5 more minutes." Angela had been performing chest compressions for nearly half an hour, and I could see the physical toll it was taking on her. Her scrubs were damp with perspiration, and her arms had to be burning from the continuous effort. But when she heard me ask for 5 more minutes, she simply nodded and adjusted her position to continue. Later, she would tell me that something about that night felt different, that she couldn't shake the feeling we were meant to keep going. The thing about chest compressions is that they're brutally physical work. You're essentially trying to manually pump someone's heart, pushing hard enough to circulate blood throughout the body. It requires tremendous strength and stamina, and most people can't maintain effective compressions for more than a few minutes. We usually rotate every 2 minutes to prevent fatigue from compromising the quality of care. But Angela had been going far longer than usual, driven by something I couldn't quite identify. "Let me take over," I said, moving to replace her at Bob's bedside. As I positioned my hands on his chest and began the familiar rhythm of compressions, I was struck by how much his skin had cooled. His body was showing all the signs of someone whose life had already slipped away. The grayish pallor, the way his limbs had begun to stiffen, the complete absence of any response to our interventions. But as I worked, pushing down hard on his sternum every second, trying to squeeze life back into a heart that had stopped responding, I became aware of something unusual. Margaret had begun to speak, not to us, but in what sounded like conversation with someone we couldn't see. Her words were soft, barely audible above the sound of our equipment, but I could make out phrases that sounded like she was asking for help, pleading for more time. "Please," I heard her whisper. "He's not ready." "We're not ready. There's still so much he wants to do, so much love left to give." The monitors around us continued their relentless documentation of failure. No heartbeat, no blood pressure, no signs of brain activity. Every instrument in that room was telling the same story. Robert Sullivan had left us 20 minutes ago. But Margaret's words seemed to be directed toward a reality that our machines couldn't measure. a dimension of existence that medical school had never taught me to consider. Dr. Washington was preparing the paperwork we'd need to officially pronounce the time of Bob's passing. It's a grim but necessary part of emergency medicine, documenting our efforts, noting the time we ceased resuscitation, preparing to console the family and help them begin the impossible process of saying goodbye. I could see him glancing at the clock, calculating how much longer he should let me continue what was beginning to look like denial rather than medical intervention. But something kept me going. Maybe it was the memory of my parents' words about trusting God with the rest after we'd done our best. Maybe it was the way Margaret's faith seemed so unshakable, so different from the desperate bargaining I usually witnessed from families facing loss. Or maybe it was something I couldn't name, some instinct that told me this story wasn't finished yet. 22 minutes now. I was approaching the point where even I would have to acknowledge that we'd done everything humanly possible. My arms were aching from the chest compressions, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool temperature of the emergency room. The team around me had grown quiet, waiting for me to make the call that would end our efforts and begin the process of helping Margaret face her new reality as a widow. The ventilator continued to push air into Bob's lungs, creating the illusion of breathing in a body that had stopped responding to life. The IV lines we'd established were still delivering medications into a cardiovascular system that was no longer functioning. Everything we were doing had become a kind of medical theater, going through motions that should have been stopped long ago. But Margaret hadn't moved. She stood there like a sentinel, her faith unwavering, her presence creating a force field that seemed to hold death at bay through sheer force of will. I had never witnessed anything like it in all my years of practice. The way one person's belief could transform the entire energy of a room, could make us question everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between life and passing. That moment was just the beginning. It happened at exactly 12:13 in the morning, during what should have been my final round of chest compressions before we called it. I was 26 minutes into what every medical protocol would consider a futile effort, my arms burning from the continuous pressure when I felt something change beneath my hands. Not in Bob's chest. That remained still and unresponsive, but in the very air around us. The change was so subtle at first that I almost dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But then Angela looked up from where she was monitoring the IV lines, her eyes widening with an expression I'd never seen before. Dr. Washington stopped writing in his chart and turned toward the monitors with a puzzled frown. Even the usual sounds from the hospital corridor seemed to fade, as if the entire building was suddenly holding its breath. "Doctor," Angela whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical sounds of our equipment. "Look at the monitor." I followed her gaze to the cardiac monitor, expecting to see the same flat line that had been our constant companion for the past 26 minutes. But something was different. The line wasn't flat anymore. It was showing tiny, almost imperceptible waves, like ripples on a still pond after someone drops a pebble. "That's not possible, Dr. Washington said, moving closer to examine the screen. "There's been no electrical activity for over 20 minutes. This has to be interference." But as we watched, those tiny ripples began to grow stronger, more defined. They weren't the chaotic, disorganized electrical storms we sometimes see in failing hearts. These were rhythmic, purposeful, as if something was slowly awakening after a long sleep. I stopped my chest compressions for a moment, afraid that my movement might be creating false readings. But the waves continued, growing steadily stronger. Margaret had moved closer during these crucial seconds, close enough that I could feel her presence beside the table. She wasn't speaking anymore, but there was something in her stillness that felt like concentrated prayer, like she was channeling every ounce of faith she'd ever possessed into this single moment. Her hand was still clutching that worn cross, and I noticed that her breathing had synchronized with the emerging rhythm on the monitor. "My God," Angela breathed, and I realized she wasn't taking the Lord's name in vain. She was acknowledging something sacred happening before our eyes. The waves on the monitor were becoming more distinct now, showing the unmistakable pattern of a heart trying to remember how to beat. But this wasn't the weak, irregular rhythm we might expect after such a long period of inactivity. These electrical impulses were strong, growing stronger by the second, as if some invisible force was gently coaxing Bob's heart back to life. Dr. Washington was checking all our equipment, convinced that what we were seeing had to be a technical malfunction. "The leads might have shifted," he said, examining the electrodes attached to Bob's chest. "Or there could be electrical interference from another room." But I knew what we were witnessing wasn't mechanical failure. After 18 years of reading cardiac monitors, I could distinguish between real electrical activity and equipment artifacts. This was genuine, unmistakable cardiac rhythm emerging from a heart that had been silent for 26 minutes, far beyond the point where medical science said recovery was possible. "Check his pulse," I said to Angela, though I was almost afraid to hope. She placed her fingers on Bob's carotid artery, the spot on his neck where we check for the strongest pulse point. For a moment, her face remained neutral, concentrated. Then her eyes widened. "I'm getting something," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's faint, but it's there, and it's getting stronger." The transformation happening before us defied everything I thought I knew about cardiac medicine. Hearts don't simply restart after 26 minutes of inactivity. The muscle tissue begins to die after just a few minutes without oxygen. The electrical system that controls the heartbeat becomes damaged beyond repair. The delicate chemical balances that maintain life are disrupted in ways that should be irreversible. But Bob Sullivan's heart was proving all of that wrong. The rhythm on the monitor was not only present now, it was becoming regular, strong, the kind of rhythm we associate with healthy hearts, not organs that had just endured 26 minutes of clinical demise. His color began to change too, that awful grayish pallor giving way to the faintest hint of pink as blood began to circulate through his system once again. "This is impossible," Dr. Washington said, but his voice carried awe rather than disbelief. He was checking Bob's blood pressure, which had been undetectable for nearly half an hour. "I'm reading 90/60. How is that even possible?" I looked at Margaret, who had tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of vindication, of a faith that had been tested and proven true. She reached out tentatively, as if asking permission, and when I nodded, she placed her hand gently on Bob's forehead. "Welcome back, Bobby," she whispered, and I swear I saw his eyelids flutter in response. The monitors around us were now singing a completely different song. Where minutes before they had been documenting the end of a life, they were now recording what could only be described as a resurrection. Heart rate steady and improving, blood pressure rising to normal levels, oxygen saturation climbing as his body remembered how to process the life-giving air we were providing. Angela was rechecking all of Bob's vital signs, her training taking over even as her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. "Temperature's coming up," she reported. "Pupils are reactive to light. Doctor, he's showing signs of neurological activity." Neurological activity. After 26 minutes without oxygen, Bob's brain should have been severely damaged, if not completely destroyed. But the reflexes Angela was testing suggested something that went against everything medical science taught about hypoxic brain injury. Dr. Washington was running additional tests, drawing blood to check Bob's chemistry, trying to understand what was happening from a medical standpoint. But I found myself less interested in the how and more overwhelmed by the simple, impossible fact that it was happening at all. But what truly shook me to my core wasn't just the medical impossibility of what we were witnessing. It was the realization that I was standing in the presence of something that science couldn't explain, something that challenged every assumption I'd built my career upon. In that sterile emergency room, surrounded by machines and monitors and 18 years of medical training, I was confronting the possibility that there were forces at work in the universe that my education had never acknowledged. What happened next changed everything I believed about the boundaries between medicine and mystery. I stood there frozen, staring at the monitors that were now displaying vital signs that shouldn't exist, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. For a moment, I wondered if I was the one having a cardiac event, because my own heart was racing so fast I could hear it pounding in my ears. My hands, which had been performing chest compressions moments before, were trembling uncontrollably. In 18 years of practicing medicine, I had never experienced anything that challenged my understanding of reality so completely. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in medical school, honed by years of evidence-based practice, was scrambling to find an explanation. Maybe we had misread the monitors earlier. Maybe there had been some faint cardiac activity that our equipment hadn't detected. Maybe the 26 minutes hadn't been as complete a cardiac arrest as we thought. But even as these possibilities raced through my thoughts, I knew they were desperate attempts to make sense of something that defied logical explanation. Dr. Washington was having his own crisis of understanding. I watched him check and recheck every piece of equipment, run his hands through his hair, and mutter things like, "This doesn't make medical sense," under his breath. As a younger physician, Marcus represented everything I had once been, confident in the supremacy of scientific method, convinced that medicine could explain and control the mysteries of life and healing. Watching him grapple with something that our training hadn't prepared us for was like seeing my former self confronting the limits of certainty. "Tom," he said, pulling me aside while Angela continued monitoring Bob's improving vital signs. "I need to understand what just happened here. Because what I think I witnessed—" He paused, struggling to find words. "It goes against everything I learned in medical school. Hearts don't just restart after 26 minutes. Not without massive interventions, not without permanent damage, and certainly not with the kind of strong, regular rhythm we're seeing now." I understood his struggle because I was experiencing the same internal earthquake. The foundation of my professional identity had been built on the belief that medicine was a science, predictable and controllable when properly applied. Yes, there were variables and complications, but ultimately, the human body followed certain rules. Hearts stopped when they were damaged beyond repair. Brains suffered permanent injury when deprived of oxygen. 26 minutes of cardiac arrest meant one thing, and it wasn't the healthy vital signs we were now recording. But looking at Bob Sullivan, whose color was returning to normal and whose breathing was becoming stronger and more regular, I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. Whatever had happened in that emergency room transcended the boundaries of conventional medicine. And the most unsettling part wasn't just that it had happened. It was that I had somehow known it was going to happen, felt it building in the air around us long before the monitors confirmed it. Angela approached me with Bob's latest lab results, her face a mixture of professional excitement and personal bewilderment. "Doctor, you need to see this," she said, showing me the printout. "His cardiac enzymes are actually improving. 20 minutes ago, they indicated massive heart muscle damage. Now they're showing levels consistent with minor cardiac stress, like someone who just finished a moderate workout." The impossibility of what she was telling me hit me like a physical blow. Cardiac enzymes, the proteins released when heart muscle dies, don't improve retroactively. Once heart tissue is damaged, those enzymes remain elevated for days, providing a biochemical record of the trauma the heart has endured. But Bob's numbers suggested that somehow, not only had his heart restarted, but the damage we had measured earlier was reversing itself. Margaret had never left her spot beside Bob's bedside, but now she was holding his hand, and I could see his fingers beginning to respond to her touch. His eyelids were fluttering more frequently, and there were subtle signs that consciousness was returning. A slight movement of his head toward the sound of her voice, a barely perceptible increase in muscle tone that suggested his neurological systems were reactivating. "Bobby," Margaret whispered, leaning close to his ear, "can you hear me, sweetheart?" And then, in a voice that was weak but unmistakably present, Bob Sullivan spoke his first words in over half an hour. "Maggie, what happened?" The sound of his voice sent chills through my entire body. I had witnessed many recoveries during my career, seen patients wake up from comas and surgery, watched families reunite with loved ones who had been pulled back from the brink. But this was different. This was a man who had been clinically gone for 26 minutes, whose heart had stopped completely, whose brain had been deprived of oxygen far beyond what medical science considers survivable, asking his wife what had happened as if he had simply taken a long nap. Dr. Washington was running neurological tests, checking Bob's reflexes, his ability to follow simple commands, his orientation to time and place. Everything he tested came back normal. Not just normal for someone recovering from a cardiac event, but completely normal, as if the past 26 minutes of cardiac arrest had never happened. "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said, shining a small flashlight into Bob's eyes to test his pupil response. "Can you tell me what year it is?" "It's 2024, Bob replied without hesitation. "December 15th. And I was watching the news with Maggie when I started feeling chest pain." His memory was intact, his speech clear, his cognitive function apparently unimpaired by what should have been a catastrophic period of oxygen deprivation. I felt my legs grow weak and had to lean against the wall for support. What I was witnessing challenged not just my medical knowledge, but my entire understanding of how the universe worked. I had built my career on the belief that cause and effect followed predictable patterns, that the human body operated according to discoverable laws, that miracles were just medical phenomena we hadn't yet learned to explain. But standing in that emergency room at 12:37 in the morning, watching Bob Sullivan sit up in bed and ask for a glass of water as if nothing extraordinary had happened, I realized I was confronting something that existed beyond the reach of medical explanation. Something that had entered our sterile scientific environment and demonstrated that there were forces at work in the world that our instruments couldn't measure and our training couldn't prepare us for. The most frightening and wonderful part was realizing that everything I thought I knew about life and healing and the boundaries of possibility had just been proven incomplete. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a mystery that was bigger than medicine, bigger than science, bigger than anything I had been taught to believe was real. What happened next is something I struggle to describe even now, months later, because it involved emotions and reactions that I had spent 18 years learning to control as a physician. But in that moment, watching Bob Sullivan sit up and reach for his wife's hand as if he had simply awakened from a peaceful sleep, something inside me completely broke open. Margaret collapsed into the chair beside his bed, her body finally releasing all the tension she had carried for the past hour. The quiet strength that had sustained her through those impossible 26 minutes gave way to overwhelming relief, and she began to cry, not the desperate sobs of grief we usually hear in emergency rooms, but tears of pure gratitude, of vindicated faith, of joy so profound it seemed to light up her entire face. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered to Bob, holding his hand against her cheek. "I knew you weren't finished with me yet." Bob looked confused, still trying to piece together what had happened. "Come back from where, Maggie? I just remember the chest pain, and then—" He paused, a distant look crossing his face. "It's strange. I remember feeling like I was floating, like I was watching everything from somewhere else. And I could hear your voice the whole time, calling me back." Angela was quietly updating Bob's chart, but I could see tears streaming down her face as she worked. In 15 years of emergency nursing, she had witnessed countless medical crises, but nothing had prepared her for this. Later, she would tell me that she'd never felt the presence of something sacred so strongly in a hospital room, that the very air seemed charged with an energy she couldn't name but couldn't deny. Dr. Washington was still running tests, still trying to find a medical explanation for what we had witnessed. But I could see the change in his expression, the way his scientific skepticism was giving way to wonder. He kept shaking his head and muttering, "This shouldn't be possible." But his voice carried less conviction each time. And then something happened that shattered whatever remained of my professional composure. Bob looked directly at me, his eyes clear and alert, and said, "Doctor, I don't know what you did, but I felt you fighting for me. Even when I was floating above everything, I could feel your hands on my chest, feel you refusing to give up. Thank you for not letting me go." That's when I lost it completely. 18 years of maintaining professional distance, of keeping my emotions in check, of being the steady presence that families could rely on during their worst moments. All of it crumbled in that instant. I found myself crying in front of a patient's family for the first time in my career, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of awe that left me speechless. The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors that were now recording normal, healthy vital signs. Even the usual hospital noise from the corridor seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was acknowledging that something extraordinary had occurred in our small corner of Northwestern Memorial. Margaret stood up and walked over to where I was trying to compose myself. Without saying a word, she placed her hand on my arm and looked me directly in the eyes. "Doctor," she said softly, "tonight you weren't just practicing medicine. You were part of something bigger. You were part of a miracle." In that moment, standing in that emergency room surrounded by machines and monitors and all the tools of modern medicine, I realized that Margaret was right. We had all been part of something that transcended medical explanation, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between science and faith, between medicine and mystery. But the most profound realization was yet to come. The understanding that this night hadn't just saved Bob Sullivan's life. It had transformed mine forever. 3 months have passed since that December night at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and Bob Sullivan is doing remarkably well. His follow-up tests show no signs of the massive cardiac damage we documented during those 26 minutes. His heart function is normal, his cognitive abilities are completely intact, and he's returned to work as a construction foreman, building the Chicago skyline one project at a time. When his cardiologist reviewed his case files, he called it medically unprecedented and asked if we had somehow misread the monitors that night. But I know what we witnessed was real, and more importantly, I know it changed something fundamental in how I practice medicine. I still work the same shifts, still see the same types of cases, still make the same life and death decisions that define emergency cardiology. But now I approach each patient with a different understanding of what's possible. I've learned that healing sometimes occurs in ways that our instruments can't measure and our textbooks can't explain. I've discovered that hope isn't just an emotion. It's a force that can influence outcomes in ways science is only beginning to understand. My relationship with faith has been completely transformed. Growing up in that Polish immigrant family, I had absorbed my parents' deep Catholic beliefs, but medical school and years of scientific training had gradually eroded that foundation. I had come to see faith as something for people who didn't understand science, a comfort for those who couldn't handle the harsh realities of medicine. That night, watching Margaret's unwavering belief sustain all of us through an impossible situation, I realized I had confused faith with ignorance. Margaret wasn't ignoring medical reality. She was operating from a deeper understanding that medical reality isn't the only reality. She knew something I had forgotten, that there are forces at work in the universe that exist beyond what we can measure or control. I've started attending Mass again, something I hadn't done regularly since my parents passed away 5 years ago. But now, when I sit in those wooden pews at St. Adalbert's, the same church where my family worshipped for 3 generations, I'm not there out of obligation or tradition. I'm there because I've experienced firsthand that there are mysteries in this world that demand reverence, moments when the boundary between the natural and supernatural becomes so thin it disappears entirely. My approach to difficult cases has changed too. I still use every tool of modern medicine, still rely on evidence-based protocols and scientific knowledge. But I've also learned to trust something deeper, that quiet voice that sometimes whispers when conventional medicine has reached its limits. I've become more willing to fight for patients when logic says to give up, more open to possibilities that don't fit neatly into medical categories. Last month, I had another case that should have been hopeless. A 38-year-old mother who suffered massive cardiac arrest during routine surgery. By every medical standard, we should have lost her. But something about the situation reminded me of that December night with Bob Sullivan. Her family was praying in the corner, radiating the same quiet faith I had witnessed from Margaret. I found myself pushing beyond normal protocols, continuing resuscitation efforts long after other doctors might have stopped. She came back. Not as dramatically as Bob had, but she came back. And when she woke up 3 days later, completely neurologically intact, I knew that December night had taught me something that would guide the rest of my career. Sometimes the most important thing a doctor can do is refuse to give up when everything else says it's over. I think about Margaret and Bob often. They sent me a Christmas card showing them traveling through Ireland, visiting the homeland Bob's grandparents had left generations ago. The trip they had dreamed about, but never thought they'd take. Margaret wrote a simple message. "Thank you for being part of our miracle. We're praying for you and all your patients." That card sits on my desk now, a daily reminder that medicine is about more than just treating symptoms and managing disease. It's about being present for the moments when life hangs in the balance, when families face their greatest fears, when the impossible occasionally becomes possible. I still don't fully understand what happened that night. I probably never will. But I've learned that understanding isn't always necessary for faith, and faith, real faith, doesn't require the absence of doubt. It just requires the willingness to believe that there are forces of healing and hope at work in this world that are bigger than our knowledge, deeper than our science, and more powerful than our fears. Some moments have no scientific explanation, and that's exactly what makes them miracles.